notice when my mic is not on. But this is a session on SharePoint Social and how to succeed with it. Microsoft has made a lot of investments and changes in this. For those of you who were in my session earlier, were any of you in my migration session? Okay, so some of this may be familiar to you, but I am going to start similarly. I want folks to just know who you're talking to before I walk through and pretend to be a SharePoint expert of sorts. I need to confess, there was a time in my life prior to joining Quest, now Dell Software, where I employed child labor in the pursuit of other non-SharePoint technologies. I think it's important that you know this before you accept my word on anything. And I did exactly the same thing this morning.
I used to be a big believer in the Euler from Euler Video School. And like many of you, of course I use SQL. But now that's all changed. Microsoft Dynamics helps me empower an unbelievable and global workforce in ways I've never dreamed possible.
Look at him, just like... And if you watch, at various points my dog shows up in different shots. She's, of course, not paying any attention to any of what she's supposed to be saying. Great. Well, those are two of my kids. They were a few years younger when they did that. You'll see what they look like now. But, folks, my name is Chris McNulty. I am CTO for SharePoint at Dell Software. I have been working in the SharePoint space for well over 12 years. My background and training comes in corporate systems and consulting. I ran a consultancy for a number of years prior to joining Quest, focused on SharePoint, based just outside of Boston. I went to school up there. I grew up in New York. But before we go any further, I just want to acknowledge a couple of my sponsors. Obviously, Microsoft. Actually, most importantly, all of you. You make a great trip and a great investment of time, and I really enjoy SharePoint. I'm a little passionate about it. I did tell Rachel around the time of making that video that her reward for doing that was I was going to give her her own SharePoint site. She was kind of holding out for a puppy. But before I walk through the rest of the introductions, since this is a social session, I'd like to just acknowledge that I've been working on this material with one of my presentation colleagues back in Boston, Sadie Van Buren, who contributed some of the material we're going to walk through today. She had the idea that for when we present this material jointly to use social mapping technologies from LinkedIn, because this is a network about social and about network. And what was interesting is when we did that, I found that my social network pretty much tells you a lot about who I am. And with where it shows, I've worked at John Hancock and State Street, where I went to school at Fairfield University. I think it shows pretty well. And Sadie, who's my colleague, who currently works in the SharePoint community, this large orange mass. My wife has no idea what SharePoint even is. That's it. And so it's interesting that our social networks reveal and confirm the intelligence that we think we should expect about that. So these are my secondary sponsors, obviously. My wife, Haley, Nate, and Rachel are a little bigger now. And my oldest, Devin, is off at NYU. She's technically home for the summer, but she's a sophomore there. That last picture, obviously, is not Boston. This is out on the West Coast in Yosemite about a year ago. But I do live just south of Boston, over here. I grew up down in the East End of Long Island, just right under the E in New Haven, as a matter of fact. But it's fantastic to be back here in New Orleans. It's a great city. I've had amazing food this week. I can't wait for the next time we get to do an event down here. How many of you are at your first TechEd? Excellent. Wonderful, wonderful. It's great to keep getting new folks coming into the community. One of the things that gives all of us energy and enthusiasm about this technology is the passion that you all have for it. So please keep coming. A quick note on my company, Dell Software, formerly Quest. I'm not going to speak at any length today in session about this stuff, but this is what we do. We have management. We have one of the broadest portfolios of solutions for SharePoint. If you need to manage and govern security, permissions, sites, backup, recovery, we've got that. Migrating content from anywhere, from any version to SharePoint 2007 forwarder to the cloud, we have that, and customization and deployment tools to help you optimize SharePoint. For more information, please come to our booth. I'm not talking about that stuff from the stage. So today what I am going to talk about are these topics. First off, social. What is social, and what could it be? Second, why should we even care? Social is frequently a briefing topic that I'm asked to present to customers around the world now. Everyone has a different take on it, so let's talk about what the actual practical business case is for this. How do we compare what other folks are doing? We're going to introduce Sadie's social maturity model for this. How do we measure this? And lastly, and it's by far the largest chunk of this, is how do we succeed? How do we implement social technically as well as operationally so that we can match those business cases that we're going to establish? Rules of governance for this today. We are not going to go through business intelligence in great depth, although I will expose some of the BI tool set, notably SSRS, to give you some social information and a roadmap for how to go measure your success. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. Sadie is not here, but if you have any questions for me or for her, I can definitely relay those. If I did things right on Twitter, at 5 o'clock tonight, a link to this deck should have gone out, as well as what's already on the TechEd site. I live and die by Twitter, so if you have a question for me, it's the best place to start getting hold of me. If I can't answer something for you at the end of the session today, happy to follow up with you down the road. We had some interesting discussions about social at the Ask the Experts table last night, about the word social, and should we even use the word social. It's kind of misleading. There was a time earlier in the 2010 release cycle when people were describing SharePoint and social technology as being business's Facebook. That's a real misunderstanding of what it is. For many of us, when we look at social, it connotes something like this. The image of people gathering together to have fun and have a party. I'm in this picture, by the way. That's me. I don't know what the heck I'm wearing, but... And it sort of gets a bad rap, because the truth of the matter is, this is what social really is. Years ago, we used to all walk people into a room at the same time, gather everyone around a conference table, everyone have the same pieces of paper, we would collaborate in the same time, at the same place. At the end of the day, books get folded, binders go on the shelf. That was that. We don't work that way anymore. We have teams that are spread around the country, around the globe. We have people who... work gets done when it happens to get done. People work from home, people work on flexible time. Sometimes it's through conference calls, sometimes it's live, sometimes it's strictly by electronic communication. This is how work gets done. We bump into each other and that collaboration happens organically. These social technologies are driving all of these core aspects of getting work done. So I'd like you to think at the outset, I'm going to reference David Hackett Fisher. Does anyone here know who David Hackett Fisher is? Okay, David Hackett Fisher is a professor emeritus at Brandeis University. His specialty is in early colonial American history, which is a topic I have a lot of interest in myself. One of his first books, Albion Seed, has tremendous relevance for looking at what was happening in colonial America and what we do today, and how we should design our websites, which sounds a little odd, but let's take a look at some things. So this is a house in England, built in the 1700s in Victoria County. And this is a house that was allegedly still standing on Sunday when I flew out of Boston. This is my house. And this house was built in the 20th century, and I just want to point two things out. The roof hood over each door is exactly the same. What Fisher points out is we're going to keep designing things, doing things the same way. The folks who settled England, from England, in my part of the country, they're not there anymore. In fact, culturally, it's by no means the same folks. But he said people will keep doing the same things and inheriting the same patterns without examining them for a while. How many of you only enter if you have a house, only enter your house through the front door every time? No, most of us, some people do. I mean, there's a need for it. But a lot of us enter the house by the side door, the back door. We have a mudroom, or we walk in through the garage. The ways that we live in our houses have changed, but if we don't examine the ways that we consume our home technologies, people are going to keep building things the same way without examining that. Exactly the same thing is true with our site designs. For the last 10 or 20 years, this is how we've designed intranet sites. Intranet sites have been built with a top-down approach. We start with a home portal, then we set up geographies or departments or divisions. We move down to project or team sites, and eventually we have personal sites. This is also the evolution of the technology, right? People tended to build things hierarchically. And then they look at these approaches and say, why isn't social taking off in the enterprise? Well, I don't like to point to Facebook, but let's point to that. You don't start in Facebook at the corporate home site with some stock price and then drill into Facebook US and then ultimately get back to your information. The personal experience is actually front and center. So I'd just like you to think about this over the next hour or so, that a better way to frame the structure of what we're doing in SharePoint is to move that social experience right up front. That's going to guide the things we're walking through today. There's a role for community sites and project sites and department and enterprise repository that sits in the back that if you need information to go to that library, you can get there. But it takes a different approach to be successful. So in looking at why social matters, I just want to discuss some survey numbers that we've developed over the last few years as Quest at various conferences. So we survey users of SharePoint, and I'm not going to survey this audience directly today, about how satisfied are you with SharePoint as a traditional document collaboration platform? The original workload for SharePoint, and the one that many would say it still is its strongest suit. I want you to look at these numbers. The correct answer is up there. We're not going to ask people to vote, but just think about which answer you think it is. The truth of the matter is, the answer is 63%. 63% of our survey respondents are reasonably satisfied with SharePoint as a document collaboration repository. But then we ask the question of them about social and workflow and apps and business intelligence and all the rest of the material and the rest of the processes that SharePoint has adopted over its more than a decade run so far. Take a look at those numbers. Think in your head what the number is. Is that what you thought? It's 15%. And we've gone back and we've done follow-up surveys of the respondents for this to try to figure out part of why this is so low. In many cases, the good news is there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the technology. It's that it really hasn't been turned on, especially in the case of social. They know it's there, they played with it once, but they never exposed it to a large group. And if you don't have participants, the technology doesn't take off. There's a way to close this gap, and social is one of the key workloads that you get free in 2013, and with the Yammer story, which we'll also talk about, to really expand that beyond the confines of traditional SharePoint. The other thing, some data from McKinsey, is that social technology is an accelerant and a much more efficient way of getting people to collaborate and make right decisions at the right time with the right information. So the gains of productivity they're projecting are absolutely massive. You can quibble with a number like 1.3 trillion. It's a very large number, but there is a lot of efficiency to be gained by making any progress at all in what we're doing with social. So these are the key attributes that you should be looking for. If you have 10 people in your company, you all come into work at the same time, sit in the same place, everyone talks to everyone every day, there's no need to discover what anyone else is working on, you might not be a candidate for it. But if you have any of these attributes in your organization, these technologies can help you win. And so I'll push on from that because I want to watch time. I know I'm standing between you and happy hour and you and dinner and all that. So at its core, if you haven't looked at SharePoint 2013 Social, this is the experience, and I'll have a brief demo on this shortly. But this is what you get. It is a rich, integrated feed of information where I can follow people, see what's happening on other sites, I can like things, I can consume information from here. I can embed documents, rich media, and be able to look at that information right there. The promise of this is we know that anytime you move the context that goes around a document from the document, you've introduced friction. Numbers that we've seen from analysts say, on average, anytime if you're in one program, one app, and you have to go somewhere else to get something done, you lose 15 minutes on average. By the time you get back, you have to reorient to it, or you may never get back. It's a bad process. Social in prior iterations of SharePoint was sort of the after-hours club, right? You might put an update out there, you might post some personal things out there, but people don't use the social feeds in 2010 to drive collaboration. 2013 is front and center. It's intended that this is the place you go to find what's changed in your organization, and through your ordinary activities on SharePoint, you'll communicate what you're working on to other people and be able to consume that information. You get information about who you're following, what's going on. If there are any trends of note, they will show up for you as well. There's functionality for communities and forums we'll look at briefly in demo to be able to deal with what I would call our site. In terms of where the content goes, sometimes it belongs in a personal site, sometimes it belongs in an enterprise site, but frequently that's content that I want to push to something that is going to be more loosely governed, where I can pop these sites up and tear them down as needed and allow people to participate in more than just a threaded discussion, but introduce some so-called gamification to it. Everything in SharePoint Social, and to a similar extent, everything in Yammer Social is centralized on the idea of a news feed. That it's not RSS, that we're going to collect your activities from what you're following, whether they're people, whether they're sites, whether they're topics, or whether they're documents. Anything that happens in any of those areas that you're interested in, you will discover without having to go run a search. Social is the search you don't have to run. And last major thing is we've adopted, I shouldn't say we, I don't work for Microsoft, but you see in SharePoint that we're finally using the syntax from Twitter of an @ sign to target something for a person and a hashtag to set up a classification. I live on Twitter, hashtag #MSTechEd. You instantly congregate a community in the world at large there. This allows you to set up these classifications on the fly based on usage patterns. So these are finally things that have come into the base product. So that said, let me swing over here and just show you some of that stuff in action. So here we are. I'm logged into one of my demo sites. This one is not particularly interesting. So I come over here and I see this link up in the upper right-hand corner for Newsfeed. I click that, and it's going to bring me, this is going to be a little different than what we looked at, but this dynamic page where I can see information that I've pushed and that people have responded to with me. In my company, in this scenario, the hypothesis is we're a product company. We've been trying to figure out a real product. If you've seen my metadata sessions before, we have silly products like paper airplanes and water. We're going to create a real product, but of course, we've immediately moved on to marketing. We're going to have a Super Bowl ad, and what is it? So there's this project called Project X that we're all talking about. So I have the ability to come right here and say, here in the news feed, now discussing Project X at MS Tech Ed. And let's say I want to make sure that my dog sees it for some reason. Stan McNulty is my dog. Hashtag @StanMcNulty. And that's there. I can go to anyone else's feed. If I want to see what Sadie has in her site, I can obviously click right through there, and I get an experience of how she's described herself, content that she's put out there, people, apps, and anything else that show in their stream. The news feeds are also integrated with all the site-level news feeds. You are actively encouraged to turn on the so-called site-level news feeds here. So if you look here, there's a little feed on this site. We've injected some rich media here. Right. Not going to give you the entire Harlem Shuffle, but you can embed video. You can also put links into documents. So I'm going to jump over here to a document, grab the link, paste it in here. This is a key thing to update for the project, and paste the link, post it, and then it shows there in the feed. And other people, if I log in as someone else, let's jump over here, where I'm logged in as Aaron Copeland himself, composer of Appalachian Spring. I can see that people I'm following have got information out there. And so I can reply, say, is Stan on the project? Post it there. User can also come and jump over to this. To Project X. And has a different experience there, but one of the key things, again, using the power of Office Web Apps, I can directly preview that document from here inside of the browser without having to go somewhere else. So by using the links, we can keep that information in context. So that's functionality that's available, and it takes some work to get this set up properly. This isn't auto-magically there without a fair bit of configuration that I'll introduce. But it allows us to be able to look right there, put this in there and say, needs review, I agree, my typing is horrible, post that there, and back in my own feed with people I'm following, I'm consuming that's directly there and available to me without having to go to that site. I can consume information that's on that site feed right here. I also could, if I wanted to, push that information out to any other site of which I'm a member. So I wanted to give a quick demo of those concepts. And introduce the maturity model. So Sadie developed the maturity model about 3 years ago as a way of benchmarking where organizations are in their implementation of SharePoint, partly to assess current state and identify what should be done, and also to be able to go back over time and measure progress. It's available free of charge through spmaturity.com. There's an online assessment that you can fill out. You can share the data with her site, or you can just download the model and use it on your own. So looking at the maturity model covers lots of disciplines, not just social, but looking at the data that's been collected, the maturity model is based from a 100 level to a 500 level. With all of these CMMI-derived rankings, 100 level is something typically like fire has just been invented, and 500 level is usually food cooks itself. Most of us sit somewhere in between. So 100 level, user profiles exist, there's a My Site, but it's not heavily being used. As you move up through the chain, there's some pilot use of My Sites, there's some custom fields, you start to bring in line of business data, and then moving on to a highly optimized and configured implementation of My Sites and communities. Those are the basic 5 levels for social in the maturity model. Moving from what individuals need through expanding the tools and then bringing everyone back to that unified experience at the top of the chain. Most organizations will never get to the 500 level, nor do they need to. But here's what the track record has been. Looking at social maturity over time, social maturity tends to increase the longer organizations work with SharePoint. Then we looked at it by numbers of employees, and there actually is no statistical correlation between the size of the organization, other than that there's a dip in the center. What Sadie's been able to determine is that it's the smallest organizations that are the most nimble, and the largest organization, it's a necessity that they succeed in there. It's the mid-market that actually although there's tremendous gains to be made for them, it's those mid-market companies that have made the least social progress to date. It is not heavily influenced by budget. It goes up a little bit, but not a lot, based on the budget that the organization has for SharePoint. So if this is something, if you're looking to extend social, I'd encourage you to visit the website at SP Maturity, download the model, and start measuring where you are so you can go back in 6 to 12 months and assess your progress to date. Okay, moving on to more technical topics. How do you measure this stuff going on? Social, I was talking to the prior presenter in here who was doing a session on Hadoop. Social is really a big data problem because the way that we look at team sites is a fairly ordered process. With those news feeds being distributed all over, we'll talk shortly about the distributed cache and what its role is the glue to pull all this information together into a unified experience. All this information is out there being generated on lots of sites, lots of news feeds, probably lots of different farms in the largest enterprises. How do you aggregate that? So there have been a couple of approaches that have been taken here. The one I'm going to walk through very quickly is to look at a very specific measurement. And so this is, we'll show this in demo, but I took the approach, how do we measure, is social successful? And so we're choosing here not to measure all the activities that are going on in the organization, but just to look at one aspect, which is user profiles. Users can update their profiles and make status updates. We're using that as a proxy for all user behavior. So we've built a fairly simple SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services report, to go in and look at those profile trends to see who's changing things, what are they changing, when are they changing them, to help determine what parts of the organization we're hitting, what parts of the organization we're not hitting. So let me jump over into demoing that. I have to improvise Sadie's usual banter with me when she asked me about the report and where we put it. So let's jump over. So here we are back on our site. I didn't make this one super pretty, but it's just up in the BI center. And here it is, an SSRS report. It's not fancy. Again, I'm not a branding person. I'm not a style person, but this is the core of what we have. So we can see what kinds of information are being changed. Aaron Copeland, me, and Sadie have all definitely been updating status notes field. So we know what parts of the organization we're hitting, what parts we're not. You could obviously build these reports multiple ways if you wanted to look at trends, take summaries. These are all expanded. Let's look at a little bit at how that report's actually built to measure social success. So here we are. I hope this will fire properly. So this report is built in SQL Server 2012. And in SQL Server 2012, if you're running SQL reporting services in integrated mode, you get the direct ability to design reports, edit them, and save them directly from inside the browser with this downloadable utility. So this field will come up. We can look at the data source here, which is user profiles, which is out there. It's a shared bit of information. I'll show that to you in a second. But I'm just doing something that's not necessarily standard, but we're querying the user profile database to see what information we can get from it. The data set that I return, let me call this up here. Here's this gosh awful query coming from the data source. Just to give you some color on it, let me because I've had to tweak this, this is not a visual query, but we're pulling multiple tables in from profile, doing some filtering to see what the old value was, what the new value was. A lot of gobbledygook there. I'm not going to articulate all of that for you, but with that, I get to call up a data set that looks something like this. Where's Query Designer? Sorry, hit that. And so we're able to bring out information. This is still in the raw tables here, where we can see what the old values are and what the new values are, who did it, what and when. I'm mapping it back to figure out who the users are, what property was changed, what the source was. And it's a limited time horizon. We're not going back. We're consciously not going back to grab all data from the history of time. This is to be a snapshot. The advantage of this is this report took about 20 minutes to write. A little time with a query designer, a little bit of tweaking to get to this here, where, in particular, this value, if you're playing around with, was particularly important. Or is visible equals 1 and new value data is not null, because is visible is a property in the database that does exactly what it says. There are a lot of properties that are set and changed behind the scenes. This reduces the level of noise in the query by leaving this out. As a result, we're able to come in and using the regular SSRS toolset, directly design things from here inside of the browser. And if I wanted to change, make silly changes like this. How many of you are not running reporting services in your environments today? Some of you are not. The rest of you are. That's great. SSRS is with what Microsoft put in place for SQL 2012, has some even greater powers, but this will work even if you are on SQL 2008 R2. The core integration functions would work reasonably well with SQL 2008 and SharePoint 2010 to go at the same profile data. So I have links to these reports and information out on my blog, and if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out, and I can definitely help you with that. So finally, how do we get to be successful with this? There's a lot of material to cover here. Social is about the culture and about the business cases, but in the end, it is also massively about the technology. All of this aggregation, all of this rapid collaboration doesn't happen with a lot of key tuning under the surface. So SharePoint Social at its core depends on these 4 primary services that we'll talk about: the user profile service, search, Office web apps, and the distributed cache. UPS has been around for a bit. I've told folks before, SharePoint 2013 is version 5 of SharePoint, but it's also version 5 of document management. It's version 2 of managed metadata service. It's version 3, roughly speaking, of user profiles. The user profile engine went through a lot of revisiting in version 2 in 2010 and is a lot stabler and simpler in 2013. Search has been around for a while, obviously, but bringing the fast bits in has improved it. Office web apps we'll talk about a bit. Distributed cache is brand new, and so I want to make sure we reserve enough time for that. So in setting up the user profile service, I would, if you're turning 2013 on in your organization for the first time, I hope you're doing it in the test environment, because you will be prompted during the installation process to run the so-called white wizard. When we finish the regular SharePoint installation process, the first time central admin comes up, a wizard comes up inside of the browser and asks you, do you want me to automatically create all the service apps for you and set up your first content database? If it's your first time out, sure, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of weird things that it does to database IDs. It gives them funny names. And it still puts my sites in the same web application and the same content database as your primary enterprise store. This starts to become unmanageable after a while, because those personal sites will all be sitting in this, will be driving the growth of that content. And if you want to move those to different content databases, you can, but it gets messy if they're not in the same web application. If they're in the same web application. You really want a web app dedicated to hosting the My Site host. You should have already configured search. You're going to use the user profile service set at the Search Center. We'll look at that in demo. And the source of your user profiles is usually Active Directory. You have the ability to go in and specify where in AD to bring those profile bits of information from. Did I go? No, okay. How many of you have a geo-distributed installation? So if you have a topology that looks anything like this, where you may have a central farm that sits in EMEA, regional farms that live out there, and you have different things going on around the world, and sometimes the content in each of these areas may be distinct. You may have different enterprise pools that are out there, but the users we want to have work together. If this is the structure that you're in, where you have master copies of users, there's some specific guidance for implementing extremely large SharePoint implementations. In that, the best experience is to go back to the SharePoint 2010 toolkit and use the user profile replication engine two-way. Takes some tweaking to get it done, but you have the link to where to go download that. That's the first thing that you need to turn on. The second thing is you need to use the STS server-to-server protocol. It needs to be implemented to create a token service, and I've posted the link to MSDN with where to do that. Both of these things are needed if user profiles are going to be synchronized around the world, and the documents that I follow on one of those FAR sites will show in my primary news feed there. If you don't do these two things, just keep this. This is a research topic for those of you with large implementations. It's only the site feeds from other sites that will come back to you. Following people, docs, any of the things that I follow won't come back to my primary feed. There's going to be a few patches that will improve this story that I know Microsoft is working on, so I'd encourage you to watch Microsoft's page for cumulative updates. This wasn't released in the April update, but I expect it to be coming up shortly. No specifics on when, though. In setting up search, search is also intrinsic to how the My Sites experience works. And you need to make sure that it's set up before people start using sites. Because the settings that you put in when you set up My Sites originally are going to start to be copied to each individual My Site. So there's a search button, a search window that everyone gets on their My Site that will tell them that you're telling that box where to send the search results to, where the Enterprise Search Center is that can return results to people. And if you don't have it configured right and people start setting up their My Sites, you have a lot of individual site-by-site reconfiguration to do. So this is something that you want to get right first, and is usually a predecessor to turning on My Sites. Step 3, Office Web Apps. Office Web Apps in 2010 was a core service in SharePoint, installed as a shared service application. Microsoft has made a lot of changes to the app architecture, and they're moving in this direction now. Office Web Apps is one of these apps, like Workflow, that you're encouraged, in fact, you pretty much have to move it to a separate server in the installation. The server's requirements are not as heavy as those for core SharePoint. There are some specific prerequisites. The install for Office Web Apps is not like the SharePoint install. It does not give you that little button that says, would you like me to automatically install the prerequisites for you? It will try. It may tell you what the prerequisites are that are missing, but it's not going to set it up for you. This is what you need to make sure is on the server in the first place. In most cases, you need to register the separate Office Web App with HTTPS, with certificates, and make sure that its names are properly registered in DNS so that the SharePoint servers know where to go find them if you have multiples. And when I talk to user groups, I love to ask the trick question, where do I go in Central Admin to set up Office Web Apps now that it's moved to another server? It's a trick question because you don't do it in Central Admin. It's only done with PowerShell. So on the Web App server, the first thing we need to do, just as we have to add the PS Snap-in support when I'm running SharePoint PowerShell, I have to bring the module in for Office Web Apps on the server where I'm installing it, and then run the command new Office Web Apps farm. We tell it what its internal URL is going to be, what the public URL is going to be if I'm in a public scenario. Are we going to allow people to connect to it unencrypted? At a minimum, yes. For demo purposes, that's how we're configured. But in your environment, you probably are going to run HTTPS and run that in encrypted mode. Editing enabled also controls whether you allow users to just view from the browser or obviously have the ability to edit. You technically don't need the web app servers running to be successful with social, But just as you don't get doc previews in search without it, you don't get those doc previews and that inline ability to view and edit documents in the social feeds without it. Once that's done, you can test it. Wherever you installed it, if you go to the name of that server, /hosting/discovery, you should get a bunch of XML that references Office doc types. It'll tell you you've configured the web app server appropriately. After that, we go over to the SharePoint farm. We create an SP-WAPI binding. We point to the server, and again, we tell it it's OK to communicate HTTP. It'll respond to port 80, and we're going to send it port 80 in this configuration since I'm not running encrypted. We map it to a specific security zone. It can be somewhat problematic. One of the things is the system account, the farm, if you've installed SharePoint with the farm account, doesn't get to use the Office web apps. So you need to troubleshoot using a different account. One of the most common failures here is that since it's using OAuth for its security protocol, we need to make sure that HTTP, unencrypted, will accept OAuth. HTTPS by default will. HTTP doesn't by default. It usually turns itself on, but if it doesn't, this has been one of the most frequent support things I've seen. This is the basic syntax for how you turn that on. Distributed cache service. There are lots of caches in SharePoint. My good friend Sean McDonough is not presenting here today, but he's online and has a lot of blog posts and articles and presentations about how to optimize SharePoint with caching, whether it's the IIS cache or the blob cache or the in-memory cache or the object cache. Distributed cache is brand new. Distributed cache is a service that sits in the background and collects information from other servers, from other services that would be really hard to get in real time and give good user response. And it operates as a shared pool of memory. It's turned on by default. And the health of distributed cache is essential to the health of the SharePoint social experience. It takes 10%, it's on automatically, and it'll consume 10% of the available RAM from every server in the pool. This is a place where accepting the defaults will get you in trouble. So it is running using an extension to Windows Server App Fabric. There is specific guidance on TechNet. It's in big, bold letters, and I've never seen language this scary, that says, if you ever use the Server App Fabric app to try to configure the distributed cache, you will junk your cache and have to rebuild your servers. So don't do that unless you like rebuilding servers. It should be administered through central administration or through PowerShell. In central admin is where we go to make sure the service is on or off. As you move beyond the small organization to certainly the mid-size enterprise, it is a best practice to start dedicating servers to the distributed cache service. The guidance is take whatever, and those dedicated servers obviously aren't going to be doing anything else but running the distributed cache service. We'll strip all the other SharePoint services off of those. In those situations, we don't want to take all the memory. If we have 16 gig of memory on that server, we want to allocate 14 gig to the distributed cache. Whatever memory is available to you on the server, you only want 2 gig on at a time. Distributed cache servers don't play well with some of the app workloads. So you may think that since search is your primary app that's out there, it's okay to have it on there. Don't. It's okay to have small distributed cache servers participating on the web front-end servers, but if you start to have dedicated cache machines, make sure that you don't have the service on with Search, Excel, any of the BI components. And also in VM environments, absolutely must keep dynamic memory allocation off. If you're using Hyper-V and you have that capability, distributed cache wants to have a predictable flow of memory. And those dynamic memory allocations that are jumping up and down will cause distributed cache to, it won't permanently lose information, but it'll lose the visual presentation of the information and bog the system down because it will suddenly not see memory that it thought it could count on. If you have multiple cache servers out there, they all should have the same amount of memory, somewhere between 8 and 16 gig of memory, and you can have a maximum of 16 distributed cache servers. I haven't heard anyone coming anything close to those numbers, but those are the rules for distributed cache. Don't taunt this service. It will mess you up, man. Okay. So administering all of this stuff, if you're hunting around in all the new SharePoint stuff, you'll see the ability to manage social tags and notes. You can look at social items and delete them, but you're not going to purge it from the term store inside of central administration. If you see the thing that says, I want to administer following, because that's a question I've heard a lot. I want to start controlling users in this department can't be followed for reasons of privacy and the like. Following is throttled but not directly controlled. You can put a maximum number of users who can follow you and who can be followed, but you can't get down to that specific granularity of it. Quotas, another one of my favorites. By default, the default size of the site template that governs a 2013 My Site is 100. One of the bits of functionality in SharePoint is SkyDrive Pro, this personal document storage that's available to everyone. So user behavior when organizations move to social is typically to look at it and say, wow, I have a personal store, I can synchronize it across all my devices, and I can share it with other people. I have a lot of stuff that's on my laptop that I want to be able to work on at home, so I'm going to move all my stuff up to SkyDrive Pro. It's the natural instinct. The quota size is 100 meg. If a user fills their My Site, all the rest of the social functionality stops. Because in the architecture, everything we post to those feeds goes into the content database that user's My Site lives inside. So filling the quota is bad first user experience. 1 gig is probably a better number to start most users out. Was talking to an enterprise in Connecticut about a month ago. They're rolling SharePoint 2013 Social out to 26,000 users. The initial size is 5 gig for each user. So this is another one of the settings that you're going to want to go back and revisit. When you were playing around in social, you will see a link to sites. I didn't have time to demo this, but you have the ability to not only do users follow sites, but you can push, you can promote or advertise certain key sites that they should always be able to have one-click access to. That comes from inside a link called Promoted Sites, we'll take a look at in demo. And then community sites. Community sites, upon first exposure, don't make a lot of sense where things are and what you do with them, but the settings are available to you directly on the homepage of any community site. The key things you're going to want to look at are the reputation settings. When you see on a community tool site reputation settings, this is what it's opening up for you. How do we want users to rate posts? How do we want to show achievement levels? So if users have done any single post, they get to level 1. The more posts, you've got some control of how highly they get scored. You can also give other badges out to users through this. Mark someone as an expert or a guru. You can have them automatically be displayed as text, an override, level 1. Some control of, if you have a large question and answer area, this is something I'd encourage you to make sure that you visit. So let's look at some of that tooling under the hood. So inside Central Admin, the core services that we're going to administer live inside of service applications. And this whole laundry list of them is all coming down through the practically server within itself, user profile service app. There are some service apps that have almost nothing you can do inside of them. There are some that have a lot, and this is one of them. So the core thing here that you may need to do on a day-to-day basis is look at single user profiles. If someone needs you to change a particular property, I could come here, spdemo, sm, it will show me smcnulty, and here's where I can come and look at the properties of this user. We give users the ability to edit their own profile, but here I could come in and put, for example, a phone number. If this user was unable or unwilling or made a mistake and we wanted to step in on their behalf and do it. That's a fairly common behavior. Let's look at some ones that are a little further under the surface. So Here at Manage Promoted Sites, let me introduce what that is. So I am currently logged in. If I come here and look at the Sites link in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see sites I'm following. In my current login, I'm not following any sites. But all of these things up here, you have the ability to specify sites that you want to push to people. And they can be sites that live inside SharePoint, like this home one. They can also be sites that live outside SharePoint. So my own personal blog, which lives over at chrismcnulty.net, I have as a link there. That gets managed through the promoted sites setting. So this is where you come to manage promoted sites. Here's where I could say, I could put a particular URL in, whether it was something that's here or something that lives elsewhere. You have the option of putting images in, targeting it to specific audiences. Because what happens over time, I have to put an owner in. Because one of the user behaviors that we've observed is that user will use this sites feature here over time as a quick touchboard for where are all the sites that I'm following, because you can follow sites. They come here to get to quickly get to the Project X site or a community site or anything that someone has decided that they want to think of as kind of an enhanced bookmarking system. But you control this top real estate, and so any things that you want to promote to people, whether it's permanently or for a short period of time, that's where promoted sites lives. Configuring quotas is the other area you can expect to have to visit on a fairly regular basis. So most sites are going to run from individual quota. So if you wanted to define the site quota that we want to set, here I'm saying for my personal site, I'm currently in this site collection. I'm using an individual quota, and I'm overriding it to say I want 2 gig of storage for me. Send a warning email at 1800, and it shows you what's currently being in use. I can also come here, flip to other site collections, and see what other people have. Johann Sebastian Bach, for example, in his personal site. He's using the personal template. I haven't had to override it yet. It's not locked, and he's only using 1 mega content. So this is the place where we want to get those quotas set up and configured properly before users start plunging in and getting shut out of the system. The other area I want to make sure that gets visited outside of application management, inside of the My Site user profile service. So where those profiles come from and search. So the core information that I want to make sure is set up here is set up through synchronization connections. So when I configure this, I'm prompted to have an account that has the correct access to do profile replication, if nothing greater, in Active Directory. I think I just lost this. So I can come here and see I have a connection. It's named this. If I want to edit this connection, we open up Active Directory. Oh, sorry. So that's not going to run because synchronization is ongoing right now. I'm going to stop the run. If there's time, I'll come back and take a look at it. But so I'm just watching time. I'm going to move on from this a little bit. Tips of social governance. So one of the definitions of governance I love is one I found on a Microsoft site a while ago. I'm not going to read it to you, but talking through the key things that they're highlighting here is that it's policies, roles, responsibilities, and processes that guide, direct, and control. So it's about people and it's about process. It's about guidance and control. It's not just about shutting things down, but encouraging the right behaviors in cooperation with people. So there's a carrot and stick approach to all of these sorts of things. Probably the best example of it is what to expect in user behavior with some of the sharing functionality that's driven from my sites. In SharePoint 2010 and earlier versions, I typically share files by moving them to a more public area. If something starts out private and I want to push it to a larger audience, I find that larger audience's site and make a copy of that document over there, and so on and so on. In 2013, we share by sharing. This is probably an early win that you can get in your organizations by introducing this to folks. Where are we sharing these things? Well, Microsoft has taken an interesting approach to naming this technology. The Microsoft name for similar functionality in the past had different names, but now it's called SkyDrive Pro. And in the user interface in the upper right-hand corner, it's labeled as SkyDrive to be compact. But it is very different from the consumer service called SkyDrive. That consumer service always lives in the cloud. The organization I mentioned before had to get some education because they're a regulated industry. They will not go to the cloud, not anytime soon. And the fact that the name was SkyDrive kind of gave them a roadblock to get over because they didn't want to push their information into the cloud. It's not going to the cloud. It's going wherever SharePoint happens to be. If you are on Office 365, then you are in the cloud. But if you're on premises with a SharePoint 2013 installation, then the SkyDrive Pro link here, which is just called SkyDrive, goes there. SkyDrive Pro has offline clients that are available. As of last month, Microsoft made those clients free. They used to be tied to Office 2013, but the Windows client is available free now, and Microsoft is committed to making a release of SkyDrive Pro available this year for iOS and other platforms to follow. When users put documents out into their personal share, SkyDrive Pro begins with everything being private. In earlier versions of SharePoint on my site, there was a shared documents and personal documents. In 2013, you just have documents. And it's the user choice which ones get shared. They start out all locked down. Understanding user behaviors. Doing this kind of information sharing where information might be in a team site, or it might be on a personal site, or it might be contained in a conversation, is a challenge to the traditional way we look at these things. This is one view of information architecture. It's a hierarchy. We start at the top level. We have multiple websites and multiple departments. Here's a different way of structuring the information. We're looking at it from an org chart perspective. Or we look at it from a mapping exercise by how I group similar bits of information. The truth is, if I start layering all these things on top of each other, I'm going to get to confusion. Now, the nice thing about social is it matters somewhat less where the information is because I'm using news feeds and common tags to get people to the right place and not have to remember to check every site that I'm a member of to see what's changed. However, with this complexity, people do consume this information in a variety of ranges. This graphic's derived from an article I wrote about 2 or 3 years ago about how users experience information. Traditionally, we really drive towards this standard in the upper right-hand side. We want the site's design to be so intuitive that users can just click to get where they're going and browse for it. There are some users who search. There are some users who look at indexes and maps. And we used to regard this lower left quadrant as bad. Mailers was my term for people who never actually go to any information directly on the site. They just call someone else up or send them an email saying, "Where's the document? Can you send it to me or send me a link?" That actually was the beginning of looking at social collaboration because that behavior is not a bad one in a social sense because we get guidance and navigation by watching other user behaviors, except instead of actively having to ask someone, we can observe what they've posted and consume that information that way. So deriving information from other users isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, remember what's going on. In 2010, we typically share by moving documents around, or worse, by emailing. Then the documents leave SharePoint, and we shift the collaboration to being somewhere else. So I have some data in one platform, some in another, and the odds are we're not bringing it back to a coherent whole. In 2013, if you follow that little context window for any document, you get the ability to share. When I share a document, whether it's on my site or my team site, we're allowing users to, in a much friendlier way than they ever could before, directly send people links and set the right permissions on that document. And that's a regulated process. You can turn it off if you don't like this. But this gives them, in language they can understand, visibility to see who currently has access to a document and who they want to add to it, since they are usually the best to understand what that information is. What does that mean for libraries? Well, in SharePoint 2010 and earlier versions, if I look at documents in a library, I usually see permissions that look like this. Even though granular permissions were introduced in 2007, for most cases, everything in a library has the same permission, with some exceptions. In 2013, we've added the Share button. And when I click that, it usually leads to something like this. It doesn't matter whether the document area is called Private Finance and started out as being a private area. Over time, based on the sharing behaviors, users may decide to share that document with other people. This is actually a good result. This isn't a problem, because this means that I have much reduced likelihood of having overlapping information and confusion for users, but it's something to consider in terms of administering it. Checking the library level permissions is no longer enough to get comfort with what's going on at the document level. You need to inspect individual documents or resort to writing custom queries or third-party tools to inspect security. There are a number of ways, as we mentioned in the guidance for this. There are third-party tools which complement and extend this information. I said I wasn't going to. Colligo definitely has positioned themselves as a social player. They participated in a social forum at the Enterprise SharePoint conference back in February in Copenhagen. I'll talk about my own social hub briefly in a minute. Other organizations like NewsGator and especially Yammer work to enhance what's going on in core SharePoint with a different approach to the technology. And other companies like Nudesic have extended it to different platforms. I'm only mentioning this because it's not technically a product. This is freeware. But Dell was just awarded Microsoft Office SharePoint Developer Partner of the Year for this. If you're on 2013, this is a free app in the App Store that lets you enhance social by bringing those outside feeds, Twitter, Facebook, and the like, directly into your SharePoint environment in 2013 today. We're very proud of this. It's there, it's free, and that's the only reason I'm actually mentioning it in a session today. But the big decisions most of us have to face relate to Yammer. There's also going to be a new version of SharePoint. I know SharePoint 2013 is relatively new. Microsoft is trying to commit to a faster release cycle. I can't stand up here and tell you that the next major release is 2016 or 2014 or any particular date, but it is coming. What's important to assess is what the SharePoint 2013 does today, which for many organizations, the social capabilities have finally met minimum, gotten to a line where it makes sense to roll it out, and to consider what the Yammer story is going to be. So if you haven't looked at Yammer, here's one of the interfaces of Yammer. This is in the website. And you'll see it is similar to what we've seen in the SharePoint news feed, where I have these threaded discussions with directly embedded documents. I can see other activity going on and suggestions going on in the organization outside of it. Microsoft acquired Yammer very late in the 2013 build cycle. So the integration, and there is some integration that's available today, but the key integration points start rolling out in summer 2013. And they're looking to have Yammer take over the news feeds for both Office 365 and eventually for how we interact with the SharePoint data today. One of the strengths of Yammer is there are multiple clients available for it today. So the clients are available now for iOS, for all of the mobility platforms, Android. I believe there may be one for BlackBerry, but don't quote me on that, and certainly for Windows Phone, as well as what you can do outside. It's in the cloud, and it is in the process of being integrated into SkyDrive Pro for all of its document sharing. Here's the core roadmap for the Yammer investment and how it filters into the SharePoint branded technologies. At some point this summer, users who are in Office 365 will will get the ability to replace the SharePoint-styled news feed with the Yammer news feed directly in the site. Microsoft is also going to roll out a Yammer app, a free Yammer app in the App Store that you can use to replace site-level news feeds if you so choose. It is up to you. It has a lot to do with the control of information and where your users are. But if you are moving to the cloud, or if you're not moving your content to the cloud but your users live there, this may make a lot of sense. Similar things happening for SharePoint 2013 on-premise in the summer timeframe. The so-called on switch will give you the ability to override that master news feed and replace it with a Yammer news feed link that lives inside of SharePoint. And the Yammer app will be there and available for you to selectively bring Yammer content down and visualize it alongside your core enterprise SharePoint content. Sometime this fall, for Office 365, single sign-on is going to be introduced. So right now, there's still a separate sign-on system for Yammer. That's coming. Office web apps support will be added to Yammer as well, and support for unified navigation. So you'll be able to navigate back and forth in a much more coherent fashion than just having a link to take you over to a Yammer feed. Most of that functionality is planned to be extended to the on-premises version as well. But again, this is your choice. As we move into 2014, Microsoft is committed to ongoing 60 to 90-day updates to the Office 365 toolset. I had dinner with some of the Yammer folks. They are able to frequently make Yammer updates every 1 to 2 weeks. So a very aggressive timeline for how they're rolling that stuff out. The bottom line is, if you're moving to social, are you moving now or are you moving later? Microsoft is going to continue evolving and integrating down the road. If your plans are not to get to SharePoint 2013 for another year or so, there's going to be a better Yammer story for you then. If you need social now and don't want to wait, you have a platform that you can deploy social on right now. The thing to do is look at those business cases that we talked about at the outset and map back how do they relate to what's known in the roadmap. This tells me it's time to stop talking. We're close to the end. So thank you very much for your time today, folks. A couple of places I'll be places to get in touch with me, obviously through email. Come to my blog. I have 2 of them. A few other places I'll be at the partner conference and a number of SharePoint conferences over the next 6 months. For evaluations, this is SES B208. And again, if you need a link to this deck, I've put that here as well, in addition to what's available on the TechEd site. 2 bits of more information. My book on SharePoint 2013, the Advanced Edition we were distributing this week. If you'd like a free copy of the older version, the 2010s Consultant Handbook, that's available free at quest.com/get-chris-book. And for information on maturity, SharePoint maturity, not my own immaturity, I would encourage you to come to Sadie's site. She can be reached at this information. You can download the model. It's free of charge. It's a really fantastic way to map what you've got. So I'll be here for Q&A. We can do this formally at the mics or informally if you want to just call out from where you are. But while we're getting that started, just some other content that may be information that you don't have. On SharePoint, there's some information on admin and a session on migration happening tomorrow. 2 related labs in the hands-on labs. I've gone through them. They're nice sessions on how to explore and configure, as well as something on site collection upgrades. I'm leaving tomorrow, so I have no more sessions today. So earlier I could say find me later at my next session, but find me later around town, I suppose. Information for the track. Obviously links out to resource information on SharePoint. The usual Channel 9 ones. You've seen this before. I don't need to stop on it. You know that you're going to win. That's the QR code for this. Again, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be sticking around. Yes?
So we're still in 2010.
Okay.
Any hope we can do something now rather than wait for
So the question is, if you're in 2010 now, should we wait for 20? Do you mean implement social on 2010?
Yeah, we're trying to do social knowledge management. We're looking at third-party products to help us bring all that.
So there's two things I'd encourage you to do. One is the 2010 social functionality is not probably what you need. I'm assuming you've explored it. There are a number of third-party solutions like Nudesic, like NewsGator, that can go in and essentially replace that SharePoint feed. The truth of the matter is Yammer does have a story for that as well. So Yammer, prior to its Yammer Enterprise, even prior to being acquired by Microsoft, offered an integration to SharePoint. It's not as robust as what's currently on the roadmap, but that's out there. You're probably looking at a third-party way of approaching that if you're committed to staying on 2010. But great question. Yes?
Do you see, I mean, does it look like the roadmap says that Yammer will eventually just make my sites obsolete? I mean, we're on 2010. We've been piloting my sites for like
Mm-hmm.
we've never gotten it beyond 100 and something users. Is there value in going through the trouble of implementing that for a 40,000 employee company and then turn around and there's no way to really convert that
Right.
again?
So that question, so to restate that if you hadn't heard it, is if I may, is the question is about, with Yammer, what's the future of my sites? So in the Yammer roadmap, what's publicly known, the roadmap for content storage for Yammer is SkyDrive Pro ... SharePoint. The expectation is that you do have a personal repository, which is your My Site. So the content that people put into a My Site, even if it's on 2013, will be sustained going forward. What Yammer is getting is the experience of that content through conversations and through the news feed. That's the particular part that they're cleaving off and running with. And also, not just extended, the Yammer roadmap presented here is for SharePoint. The Yammer conversations are being extended throughout the Microsoft toolset so that if you are on Dynamics and you're maintaining customer dialogue or communities there, that you'd be able to deal with supply chain issues or customer issues through a Yammer discussion and community. That also could spill over into an Office 365 or SharePoint area. There are some other bits of, so I would say that my sites are not going away.
As we move forward, are you saying that they will be more complementary to each other?
Yes, they're going to be more tightly integrated. I'll tell you, an open question is, and it's one I have on behalf of my company, is what's the life of a news feed expected to be? The content absolutely needs to be retained. What's the user expectation? You can always go back and search information in a news feed and recreate the context. But the question comes, if people have setting discussions up in 2013 today, do you want them in Yammer in 2 years? Or do you want to just take the 2013 news feeds, freeze them in Amber, and start with brand new feeds in the future? It's a product question because, to be honest, my company can go build that solution if there's a market for it. We're watching for that, and I'm not sure. I'm not committing that we are doing it or not doing it. I tend to believe that that the life of those conversations needs to be longer than people think it is. Another question.
Kind of in the same thread, whenever you talk about clients,
Yep.
with either folks, when you talk about the integration,
Mm-hmm.
it always becomes an uncomfortable conversation because of certain, whether it's there or not, because of certain people's perception of compliance with the cloud and how Yammer handles,
Mm-hmm.
The fact that if you want to pull stuff out, it's all API, and when it goes, there's less control, especially.
Right.
And so that's what, like for us, what I guess looking for your thoughts. For us, that makes our company nervous about SharePoint as a whole. But we're putting all this money for document management, and that's the core, and we want the social media systems as well. But if they're going to go to Yammer and they're, we're going to lose that control, why are we investing in SharePoint? Why don't we look to, another
Yeah, the question is, if Microsoft's investing in Yammer, should we, to sum it up, if Microsoft's investing in Yammer, should we continue to invest in SharePoint? Microsoft's continuing to invest in SharePoint technologies. What the core thing there is, how do we take those SharePoint technologies and make them more extensible? I've heard the issues on compliance before, and that compliance and cloud is a dialogue that's being played out across lots of enterprise technologies, not just this one. I think the story for compliance against social tools in the cloud remains a somewhat immature one. The good news is Yammer's in-the-box metrics are greatly superior to anything that you get from SharePoint. There's Yammer functionality, I think it's a third-party app that'll let you do sentiment analysis. So if you see that things in your enterprise feed on Yammer are trending negative for whatever reason, you can go in and discover how and why and so forth. But that's compliance, audit, 7 dirty words. We want to be able to see evidence of stock trade discussions and so forth. Right. That's a coming need. It's not here yet, but it's coming. Great question. Anything else? Sorry? You can. That becomes a discussion sometimes about, do you want to empower those community sites and not the SkyDrive Pro? Yep. So if your SharePoint is on premises, SkyDrive Pro is on premises.
So will Yammer link with an on-prem SkyDrive Pro then?
They're working on that. Okay? That's part of the navigation integration. Right now, it's a link that takes you to a different experience. They know they need to bring those experiences as closely together as possible. And there is more in the roadmap that's not publicly disclosed. Okay? Yeah, if your SharePoint 2013 is on premises, when you click on that SkyDrive link, you go to an on-premises content database. Nothing has left Belgium. Everything is still, data sovereignty is a key issue, and I know that that's one of the things that factors in strongly to a lot of cloud discussions and a lot of Office 365 discussions. And it is a reason why, it's one of the reasons why what's currently a $2 billion on-premises SharePoint market gets projected to go to $7 billion in 4 years. As much as the cloud's going, the on-premises market isn't exactly slowing down either. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned upcoming things for Yammer, like sentiment analysis, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else at all like out of the box for SharePoint social right now?
No. There's a couple of interesting third-party utilities that are out there that give you, similar to what I kind of put up in the SSRS thing, like aggregate posts by user. Who are the busiest users? Who are the least busy users? Those sorts of things. Right.
But I'm just wondering, any sort of like alerts or notifications, is there any component like that?
Not yet. It's being. I know there's a couple of companies that are building it. Okay.
Slightly more technical question.
Sure.
You had a news feed up and you would have a link to a document and you would have a preview.
Right.
Office web app required for that to be
Yes. Has to be there for it. When you the command to set SP WAPI binding for the farm is what tells the MySite core on that farm, go, if you see a link to a document, what's happening is under HTTPS, that file is getting zipped over to the server to return, in that message, in the SOAP message that goes out, it's saying, and I need you to return it to me in this size, or I need you to return it to me in a full screen edit window, or that's the conversation that's going on, and that's what's getting embedded inside of there. Okay?
You familiar with third-party tools like Layer 2, Knowledge Accelerator?
Somewhat, but I'm not an expert on those. So, folks, I think we can take the questions offline, but I know that we're recording this. Thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest